Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Daily Objective, and today is Philosophy Friday, and we're going to be talking about Greek mythology. Is that related to philosophy? Is exactly what I'm going to ask the professor. There's a lot to discuss. Remember, we're coming to London March 28th. That whole week, there's going to be lots of live events by the Ayn Rand Center UK, and then that weekend, of course, is Ayn Rand Con, which we'll be hanging out for, and then the day after the conference, April 4th, big special event, the details of which will be revealed later. Please let us know what you think about today's subject. Support us with the super chat or ask a question. You're going to want to ask today's co-host some questions because he knows some stuff. Please welcome Dr. Jason Rines.
Thanks very much, Tully. How are you doing?
Wonderful. So let's talk about why does this matter? Or yeah, is that a good place to start? Why is Greek mythology any different from other stuff, other stories?
Does it matter? I mean, I don't know. You picked the topic.
I did.
No. I'm joking. And by the way, forgive me. I'm fighting a cold at the moment, so I'm going to sound a little, like I have a cold. So, does Greek mythology, is it more significant than any other mythology? Well, depends on for whom. In Western society, in terms of Western culture, yes, Greek mythology, along with sort of biblical mythology, are the kind of dominant story mythologies that we have, and at least arguably since the Renaissance, it's probably been an equally, if not more important, subject matter for the arts and fiction, the visual arts as well as fiction in the Western kind of artistic traditions. So it's very important in that respect. Just, your average American kid can still name a bunch of Greek or Roman gods and goddesses. I'm teaching a Greek mythology class right now to high school students, and and any kid who's even read a little bit into this can sometimes name dozens of Greek mythological figures because it is so much a part of our kind of cultural heritage. By contrast, it's amazing if they can name 5 Babylonian gods or goddesses. Maybe they can name 5 Norse gods and goddesses, and most of those come from a Marvel Thor movie. So it's now there's nothing, I think, intrinsically more significant, perhaps, or worthy about Greek mythology that makes it, better than any other sort of culture's mythology. It just so happens to be the mythology that's been so central to Western culture and art and narrative. As for its philosophical significance, well, again, depends on what you're asking. I mean, does Greek mythology have significance for the development of philosophy in Greece? And the answer is yes. Not in part the way that philosophy critiques Greek mythology and kind of builds itself apart from it, separates it, is part of the way that philosophy initially defines itself. Is it one way is but not the only way, is in opposition to sort of the mythic traditions. And certainly mythology has been an important part of how rational discourse or scientific discourse has traditionally tried to define itself. It's what it defines itself against. So we're explaining the world, and we're not doing it this way, the way myths do it. We're doing it this other way. And so in that sense, mythology continues to be a kind of important concept or placeholder for a variety of sort of pre-scientific and non-scientific approaches to the world that people trying to define or frame science kind of frame it and define it against, right? It's a foil.
Yeah, and that's really interesting about the Renaissance, which was obviously a time where science and philosophy were going through many changes. And interesting that the painters and sculptors and other types of artists were depicting Greek gods. I would imagine maybe there was a time when even mentioning pagan gods would not have been tolerated, or certainly not, or certainly would have been frowned upon. Is that correct? Do you know? Or
I mean, I'm trying to think. There are even in even in the Middle Ages, you occasionally find in poems reference to the Greek and Roman mythological material. For example, in very far western, very Western Europe, you often hear of the matter of Britain, the matter of France, and the matter of Rome. And what that means is the sort of mythological tradition of Britain. That's all the Arthurian tales of the Knights of the Round Table. The matter of France, that's things like the Piers of Charlemagne, the Song of Roland. And then the matter of Rome, which is the kind of collective body of Greek and Roman mythology. And so, troubadours, bards, poets knew some of this stuff, but not very well. In the Western world, Middle Ages, they didn't. Almost nobody had Greek, and their Latin wasn't that good. It was, or at any rate, they didn't have access to a lot of older kind of Roman Latin, but they had some. So there was never a time, I think, where people were entirely cut off from that stuff. But it's certainly the case that during the Dark Age, during the Middle Ages, Christian mythology, which includes the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible, as well as an enormous body of stories about the saints, which is almost entirely forgotten today, was a big kind of part of their mythological tradition. So they had people told way more stories about the saints and like the miracles that they did and the relics that they left behind and so on. All that stuff is no longer, like, people don't follow or care about that, except in certain local communities. Now I'm trying to think in Byzantium, even in Byzantium, there was always some amount, I think, maybe not always, but for a very long time, well after its Christianization, some amount of respect for Homer in particular. And people maintained copies of Homeric texts and Homeric poems. So that was always sort of seen as a kind of classic of literature. And it helped that Christians could often allegorize Greek myths and, kind of say things like, well, some of these gods or goddesses are really just sort of personifications of various things. So Athena is really just a personification of wisdom or reason or something like that. Aphrodite is just a personification of passion, something like that. So that could buy you cover if you were ever worried about it. So I don't think there might have been certain periods in certain communities of intense Christianization where pagan stories fell out, but I don't know of many kind of places where there was just a complete rejection and elimination of all kind of pagan stuff. You do have iconoclast people who smash up pagan statues, but they also smash up Christian statues for any kind of visual depiction of human figures and so on. So,
Now, you mentioned like Judeo-Christian mythology, like as another type of mythology, but to give Western religion monotheism its due. A lot of philosophers had a lot to say about God, right? Like people like Augustine and onward. The way God was sort of studied was much more philosophical and sort of intellectually respectable than just maybe talking about Zeus and Aphrodite, who there's no metaphysical like study of these myths. Do you see the distinction I'm trying to make?
Well, if you go back, so where does philosophical theology begin in the Western tradition? And the earliest stirrings of it you find are in the pre-Platonic poet 6th century BCE, Xenophanes. And he is attacking the Homeric gods. He is attacking the representation of the gods in Homer and Hesiod. And he attacks it on two lines. It's anthropomorphism and it's sort of immoralism. In terms of its anthropomorphism, he says, if lions and cattle and horses had hands, they would draw their gods as lions and cattle and horses. And then he says, Thracians think think the gods are red-haired and blue-eyed. Ethiopians, Africans, think they are dark-skinned and snub-nosed. So basically, everybody thinks gods are just like themselves. They're not. He thinks of God as this sort of well-rounded cosmic sphere that shakes things with mind or intellect. And then the immoralism is that Homer and Hesiod depict the gods doing all kinds of things to other gods that we regard as shameful for humans to do to other humans. So in the Odyssey, there's a story that the bard Demodocus tells about adultery between Aphrodite and Aries when Aphrodite is married to Hephaestus. And the idea is, if a human did this to another human, we would censure them and call them a lowlife and kick them out of town. Gods are doing this to one another. And Xenophony says Homer and Hesiod made this stuff up, and they've taught the Greeks that this is what gods are like. And then you see recurrence of these themes in Heraclitus and then later Greek philosophers. And then Greek theology really takes its next big jump in the students of and followers of Socrates, particularly Xenophon and Plato, and especially Plato. And it's in Plato that you get the first argument for existence of gods, and you get arguments about what the gods must be like and what they must not be like. So, for example, in Book 2 of the Republic, we have an argument that the gods are not the causes of everything that happens. They're only the causes of good things because they are essentially good, and things that are essentially good don't make bad things happen. They make good things happen, and so on and so forth. They're not shape shifters. They don't deceive people by taking different shapes and turning into a swan or a bull to seduce somebody or whatever. All of this sort of suggests that on the one hand, there is a sort of separation of the gods of philosophy from the Homeric gods. So the gods of the philosophers are looking increasingly less like the characters in, say, the Homeric epics or the poems of Hesiod or other Greek poets. Yet at the same time, they continue to be beings that Plato et al. Want to demonstrate are real and want to be, and they want them to be worshipped in the state, just with but with better philosophical bona fides. So they're more philosophically credible, they're less unrealistic, they're less immoral, but they're still to be worshipped. And you have to, I think, realize that there's that Greek religion is not the same thing as Greek mythology, and Greek mythology is not the same thing as Greek religion. They obviously overlap significantly, but it's not the sort of same thing. And you can worship Zeus without absorbing or believing all the stories about Zeus, because there is no canon, there's no holy Bible for the Greeks. There's no text that you absolutely can't throw out. If there were, it would be the poems of Homer. And even those, Plato is willing to censor and heavily edit to change the depiction of the gods within, to make it something philosophically defensible and morally appropriate. Okay, so I say all this as a way of saying that Greek philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, were already trying to make the Greek gods philosophically more respectable and defensible. And not just they're trying to cover up for bad myths and kind of try to preserve Greek religion at all costs. They really do think there are gods. Plato and Aristotle really think there are gods, and they think there must be for the operation of the universe to make sense as they understand it. It's just that they don't think it makes any sense to have a lot of this baggage of old mythology. And Aristotle in particular is very clear that a lot of this mythological baggage is just so much kind of cultural detritus, stuff that's sort of built up foolishly over the centuries, but we can kind of strip that away sometimes. But he still wants religion to be a part of the state as well. So they're not trying to get rid of gods. They're not trying to get rid of the worship of gods. They think that's important. And they are trying to prove certain things about the gods that make them look a whole lot like what philosophers in the Jewish or Christian tradition are trying to make their gods look like. So there's a whole lot of stuff, even with monotheism, there's a whole lot of stuff in the Hebrew Bible that makes God oddly anthropomorphic, especially in the parts of the Hebrew Bible in the first 5 books of Moses called the J text, the Yahwist text, where God looks really anthropomorphic and he does all kinds of irrational things and he has a body and he walks around and all kinds of things like that that are problematic for philosophical or philosophy leaning Jews and Christians too. And what's more, the arguments for the existence of God, the arguments for the benevolence of God, for the perfection of God, all those kinds of theological arguments that Jews and Christians start using are ones they literally take over from Plato and the Stoics and a little bit Aristotle. So they're using pagan theological arguments to kind of develop their own Abrahamic monotheistic theology. And to their kind of conception of a very serious God is built on, a very philosophically serious God is based on the philosophically serious God of the Stoics and Aristotle and Plato as well. So I think there's continuity here. It's things change when Abrahamic monotheists, Jew and Christian, try to adapt pagan polytheistic arguments. So a bunch of the arguments for the existence of God, arguments that Christians and Jews and Muslims still use today, are oddly susceptible. You might think are odd. It's not odd when you know the history, but seem oddly susceptible to objections that they don't prove that there's one God. They're proved that there's at least one God. There's nothing that makes it monotheistic. And the reason is, of course not. These are arguments developed by polytheists who never intended there to only be one. And then, monotheists developed supplementary arguments to show why it could only be one God, using arguments that sometimes are based on arguments from the unitariness or the uniqueness of the Platonic forms, incidentally. Like Plato has these arguments, there can only be one form of horse, or there can only be one form of XYZ. And it's kind of an adapt. I don't think it was deliberately this, but it's more or less the form of that argument that becomes some of the uniqueness arguments for the monotheists. So I know that was a long answer, but that's all just to say, in the Hebrew Bible, at times, Yahweh or Elohim looks pretty human, pretty silly, and so on. And Jews and Christians had to do the same kind of allegorizing work, the same kind of philosophizing work to build a space between their theology and their myths. Christians certainly have to do it in the case of Jesus, to kind of Jesus as a concept, as a philosophical figure, versus Jesus as a character in the Gospels or in the letters of Paul or in other places. So, yeah.
Okay, there's a lot I'm learning. Now, did Homer invent the Greek myths, to your knowledge? Does anybody know where they came from, or did he just write very famous poems starring those gods?
So the first thing is there's no such person as Homer.
What?
Classicists.
Wait a second. Really?
Yeah. So Homer is the name of a legendary poet to whom the Greeks ascribe the Iliad, the Odyssey, and a certain number of other poems, a comic epic called the Magrides. Sometimes they assign to Homer a series of hymns called the Homeric hymns, though we know that those got written down later than the Iliad and Odyssey. The Iliad and Odyssey themselves are oral or poems from an oral tradition that bards had been singing for generations, going back well into the Bronze Age, because they depict a Bronze Age world, even though they also are sort of told and they get written down in the Iron Age. So you get these occasional anachronisms that are very telling for us. There are debates about whether all of the Iliad as we have it and all of the Odyssey as we have it are all one work or different accretions. They clearly show they have all the traits of oral poems. It's sometime in the 8th century BCE, early 8th century BCE, when the Greeks rediscover writing based on the Phoenician alphabet, that they commit to writing oral poems like the Iliad and the Odyssey. One of the great problems that has always beset classical scholars is whether it is the same author who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. This is literally called the Homeric problem. And I think most scholars, there are still some people who think it's the same poet. But even to say the same poet, what do you mean there? Not the same poet who composed all this stuff, because they're part of an evolving oral tradition. Maybe the same poet whose version of this was put down in writing by the poet himself, by some separate person, a scribe, not clear. And I think most scholars today tend to think that the Iliad and Odyssey are probably by different poets, but it's not it's not uniform there either. But what scholars do agree on is like there's just nobody in particular we're referring to when we say Homer. Homer is like a designator that to which the Greeks assigned a bunch of their best poetry. Now, having said that, did Homer invent the Greek myths? No. First off, we have evidence that various Greek gods who are known from the 8th century on, when the Greeks, in the Iron Age, when the Greeks relearned writing, gods like Zeus and others were already being worshipped centuries before the Greek Dark Ages, in the Bronze Age, in the Mycenaean Age. So basically, up until about 1200 BCE, the Greeks have a culture that looks a lot like other cultures around the Mediterranean and Near East, more like the Egyptians, more like the Hittites, more like the Babylonians, with big central palaces and priest kings or something like that, highly centralized economies with ultra elites. And that's in the Bronze Mycenaean Age. Their culture collapses. Lots of Bronze Age cultures collapse around 1200 BCE. But before they collapsed, we know that they had gods like Zeus and Dionysus, some of these other gods who are known later. Then there are about 400 years without writing, the Dark Ages. They regain a new system of writing based on the Phoenician alphabet in the Iron Age, around 800 BCE. Okay, so we know that these Greek gods, were already worshipped in the Old Bronze Age before their collapse. On top of that, there's lots of evidence within the Greek mythology, things like Hesiod's Theogony, things like the Iliad and the Odyssey, that show the clear influence of older than the Greek societies and cultures and their myths. So there's lots of evidence that Hurrian and Hittite mythology influences things like Hesiod. There's signs of influence of Babylonian mythology, for example, in things like the Apateidios, the deception of Zeus. There's things that seem to show bits of an old Babylonian mythology about the ancient primordial powers of water being what gave birth to all the gods. So we know that lots of Greek myths have an older Near Eastern source. The Greeks have a flood myth. We know that's much, much older than the Greek myths that preserve it, and it's much older than the Hebrew Bible that has a version of it with Noah. We know it goes back to the Sumerians. So, and then the Akkadians or Babylonians, sometimes called them. Anyway, so that's Homer, or whoever committed these oral poems to writing. First off, there was already this old, long-standing body of myths that people had been telling for hundreds of years before they got written down. And then on top of that, we have direct kind of archaeological evidence that at least some of these gods already had those names and were worshipped for centuries and centuries before. And we have evidence that many of these myths are imported or are Greek evolutions of older mythology that is older than kind of Greek poets.
Okay, so why do we what makes them Greek? Is it the innovations that the Greeks did? Is it the way that these myths impacted Greek culture and kind of what the Greeks did with them? Or is it simply because the Greek culture stands out historically, so we tend to just credit them for myths that were not uniquely theirs?
Well, in many cases, it wasn't until the last 2 centuries of scholarship that we knew very much about pre-Greek mythology. Remember, it's not until Louis-Jacques Champollion that Egyptian hieroglyphs were translated in the early 19th century. I think in the 1830s or 40s is when he cracked hieroglyphics, which means that they basically stood unread for almost 2 millennia. And we have a little bit of an Egyptian priest writing some stuff in Greek named Manetho, who tells us some stuff about Greek mythology. Plutarch tells us a little bit about Isis and Osiris. Other than that, we didn't know like Greek, we didn't know Egyptian mythology. Similarly, until major archaeological discoveries in the 19th century, we didn't have the Epic of Gilgamesh. We didn't have its version of the flood story. We didn't have the Enuma Elish, which is like the Babylonian creation. We didn't have until translations of Ugaritic. We didn't have Canaanite mythology until the 20th century, and similarly with Hurrian and Hittite stuff. So in many cases, we just didn't know what these other mythologies said. And once we did, it was amazing. And we were like, oh my gosh, this is where so much Greek mythology is coming from.
Okay.
And so serious scholars, real scholars of ancient Greek and Roman mythology, trace things back to that. Another major innovation was kind of reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European and comparative mythology. It also develops in the 19th century, which allows us to kind of see common roots for the Indo-European languages and possible even common roots for some of their stories. So, for example, there's some reason to think that things like the Homeric hymn to Hermes, which is the story of a young god Hermes stealing his brother Apollo's cattle, is probably from a similar archetype as certain Celtic mythology, like the cattle raid of Cooley. And its own, we now know, that like various myths about dragon slaying or slaying of a sea god by a thunder god goes back to lots of Proto-Indo-European, maybe as far back as Proto-Indo-European. It was only when we compared the languages of Sanskrit and Greek and Latin, and then Celtic languages and Germanic languages and many, many others, that we came to realize that there was a kind of common god who goes back among the Proto-Indo-Europeans maybe to 7,000 years ago, maybe, or 6,000 years ago, named Deus Piter, shining sky father, bright sky father, who is that's the etymological origin of Zeus, and it's the etymological origin of Jupiter and a bunch of other gods in other traditions that we now know. So that was another thing that showed us common origins of these myths. So now it's Greek myth or Greek and Roman myth precisely to the extent that it's preserved in Greek and Roman literary and artistic remains. And so that's what makes it those myths rather than something else. When you have a version of it that's preserved in Babylonian, when you have a version of it preserved in Ugaritic, it's also an Ugaritic myth, or it's also a Babylonian myth, or a Sumerian myth, or what have you, or a Hittite or Hurrian myth. So it's really, and obviously we have way, 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 way more surviving Greek literature than we have some of these other things. Now, I should say literature. Now, in some of these cases, some of these ancient Near Eastern civilizations, we have an enormous amount of writing preserved, but the vast majority of it is commercial documents preserved, in pottery, and too rarely is it like core literary or religious documents that we really crave as a way of getting a better insight into their culture and stories.
Okay, now in the current era that we live in, we talk sometimes about the Disney version of things. So like Hercules being a perfect example. Somebody bring up Hercules. Wait, is that the Disney version or like the real Hercules? Am I right to think of the Greek myths as in their own context, like the Disney version of those myths? Like, were they especially goofy and silly, and did that sort of give rise to a very can-do attitude by the Greeks? Like, like reading Homer, you see the men are honorable and the gods are silly. Like, is that uniquely Greek, and did that give rise to the cultural developments?
So Greeks almost never wanted to pick their gods as silly. That would be an insult to beings who are better than us in every way. But you do see a kind of focus on a selectivity, right? We focus on certain stories, not others. And there is real worry for the Greeks, from Xenophanes on at least, about some stories about their gods or heroes that just don't seem suitable for teaching young people. And sometimes the result is to bowdlerize them, is to kind of moralize them, clean them up. Plato advocates doing this systematically on a citywide basis and not admitting any of the older dirty versions, essentially, of these stories. Um, but but that doesn't, I mean, they didn't have, as far as I know, like cleaned up versions of Homer. In a way, Homer was too highly regarded as a literary source to do that. It would be like if someone was like, let's do a highly edited version of Shakespeare. And, like where we cut scenes out, and people would be like, you can't do that. It's Shakespeare. You can't take a scene out of Romeo and Juliet. Like, you're going to write a better scene than Shakespeare, right? Like, so it didn't really, but that didn't really happen. But that doesn't mean that they taught all the parts of these books equally often. And certainly certain problematic parts, they seem to have tended to avoid with young students, at least. But you don't have something like Disney's Hercules for the Greek versions of Heracles, right? In Disney's Hercules is not the love child of Zeus and a married queen, who Hera is jealous of, and then Hera sends serpents to strangle it in the cradle and then plagues it for the rest of its life. Hercules is the perfectly in wedlock child of Zeus and Hera, loved by both parents, who for some reason Hades steals some of his divinity from, so he's half mortal. That never, and then besets from there on. Like you don't see things like that. Now you do see all kinds of varieties of myths among the Greeks. So it's not like there's ever a single definitive version of almost any Greek myth. There's always versions of any given story. And sometimes a figure who is a god in one place is just a hero or demigod somewhere else, or vice versa. Locally they worship this person as a god. Other Greeks just think they're a hero or something like that. I mean, so you see lots of variety like that. But you don't, and then another thing you see some effort to rationalize Greek myths, particularly in the 4th and 3rd centuries on, post Plato, post Aristotle, post the Stoics, so that they'll try to take a kind of myth that seems really crazy or hard to believe and then reinterpret it in a different way. A famous example is in the Bacchae, Euripides' last play. He died just before it was produced. Sophocles helped put it on. Dionysus is trying to bring worship of himself to Thebes, the city that his dead mortal mother was from and a princess of. And there's a lot of resistance to his worship. And Tiresias, the blind seer, kind of plays the role of sophist at one point, trying to say to the young king Pentheus, who's resisting the worship of Dionysus, well, perhaps you've heard this story, that Dionysus was thigh-born, meaning he was born from Zeus's thigh. He was partially destroyed along with Semele, his mother, and then Zeus sort of took the little bits that remained of this fetus, Dionysus, sewed it into his thigh and gave birth to it, which is how Dionysus can be a full god, even though he's one half mortal, right? And he says you might find it hard to believe this thigh-born or twice-born story, but actually it's a linguistic corruption. Actually, the word for thigh-born is really this word. It's much closer to this other Greek word, which is for like a hostage. And the reason is Hera was angry about this guy, and so Zeus made a doppelganger of him out of a cloud, and he handed the cloud doppelganger over to Hera as a hostage. And the two words in Greek like look very similar. And people got a letter wrong, and then they thought it was thigh-born when it was handed over, or whatever it is. I forget the details. It's been 20 years since I read the Bacchae, but in Greek. But in any case, that's the sort of example of we're rationalizing. Like, you don't have to now. It still has a myth, right? There's still this myth of, oh yeah, there was this doppelganger and there was this cloud, fake Dionysus, and Hera was involved. But like the idea is, it's a little more plausible. And you might think like, well, why? You might think, why is this a little more plausible? But you might think, I don't know, maybe just some part of the audience that was more plausible than this other part, right? Like they could go with Zeus making a cloud doppelganger. That you see that in other Greek myths. But the idea that he has a thigh, a womb in his thigh, that's silly, right? Like, I don't know, but that's just meant to be an example of like I said, you don't get something straight up like the Disney versions, although sometimes Plato suggests doing something like that. But you do get efforts to rationalize some of these myths. The other
Okay.
main way they do it is allegory. Greeks invent the concept of allegory. They invent this idea of these gods really symbolize different abstract things. And so the story is really saying, when Athena jumps down and tells Achilles not to kill Agamemnon, that's just wisdom. That's just prudence telling him don't do that.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's pretty amazing. If the Greeks invented allegory, then I would say the myths rightfully should be called Greek in the way we look at myths today, regardless of any earlier iterations of those characters.
And it's worth pointing out, I'll just say very briefly that the hermeneutic tool, the tool for the interpretation of stories or texts that is allegory, is developed by Greeks struggling with making sense of Homer or these other stories about their gods. It is then directly adapted by Jews and then Christians. Starting in the first century, we see Philo Judaeus, Philo the Jew, Philo of Alexandria, use the tool of allegory to reinterpret almost all the books of Moses, the Hebrew Bible, but especially the Torah, first 5 books of Moses, in terms of Platonic philosophy. So that essentially every character, every story in Genesis through Deuteronomy sort of is seen through the lens of kind of as symbols of Platonic type concepts for a Platonic-like philosophy. For example, Abraham is from the land of the Chaldeans. We would call them the Babylonians or something, or Mesopotamia. And then he and his father Terah flee to Haran, and then from there Abraham enters into Canaan, which becomes the land of Israel later. Philo interprets this as, well, what are the Chaldeans known for? They are known in the ancient world for being astronomers, studiers of the heavens. And then Haran he associates with the 5 senses. And he says, so Abraham is somebody who came from a kind of background of naturalistic sense perception based science of trying to, and based on the senses, and then his leaving that land behind and going into Canaan is him kind of turning inward into the soul, away from the senses, and then discovering the intelligible world and God there. And so this whole story of like the flight of Abraham and Terah is reinterpreted as a kind of transcendence from sensual, physical science philosophy to Platonic, transcendental, noetic, non-sensual, but soul-based, inward-looking philosophy.
Sounds like Philo was doing with Jewish stories what some Greeks had been doing with their own gods.
Yes.
So I think what you said earlier is that there's a couple of ways in which mythology meets philosophy. One of the ways being that people say, there is a scientific approach, and contrasting it with just belief in the divinity of gods. And another way is in rationalizing the gods and trying to give them an explanation. You're sort of you're making things more philosophical. Was that it?
Yeah. So the earliest kind of views of saying, hey, philosophy is opposed to mythology. These are 2 different kinds of discourse. That distinction really solidifies in Aristotle. Some people see it in Plato, but I don't think they're right to see it clearly. There are 1 or 2 characters. They are sophists, or Socrates speaking to sophists, where he'll say something like, Socrates will say, you will call this a made up, an invented muthos. That's where our word myth comes from, muthos. But I say it is a logos, an account. That happens once or twice in Plato, but you also have the Timaeus, Plato's story about the creation of the cosmos by a god called the demiurge, the craftsman, this supremely good, intelligible being. And it's equally called a muthos and a logos. And the reason it's sort of both is because any story, any account of the sensible world, Plato thinks, is never more than a likely story. You can have a precise sort of scientific account of the forms, because they are precise and eternal things that don't change and that are really real and that are in themselves the thing you can give a precise account of. This kind of muddy, fluctuating world, you can never give more than a just so story about. Now, it can be an okay story, it could be true, but it's always going to be a little mythical. So Plato seems to think when we talk about the sensible world, we're telling stories, some better than others. It's not that there's nothing to it, but it's pretty loosey-goosey compared to an account of the intelligible world. At least that's how I understand Plato's distinction. But then in Aristotle, you get very much a distinction of him saying, like, there were the theologians, which just means the people who gave logoi, stories, accounts of the gods, the theoi. And then there were one or two transitionary figures like Pherecydes of Cyrus, and then you get like the early philosophers. And it seems like the difference is all of these people are trying to account for the cosmos in terms of certain basic forces and origins. And the earlier people used mythological characters. They used gods. They said it all comes from ocean and Tethys, or it all comes from Gaia and chaos. And then over time, people are like, it comes from water and heat. It comes from the dry and the wet. It comes from the light and the dark, the rare and the dense. And Aristotle thinks that's a significant change, although he thinks that some people continue to do their accounts of this stuff more or less as myths, just using these forces now in place of old gods. So somebody like Empedocles tells these stories about these warring forces or something, and maybe it's not all that different from different gods fighting each other. But actual scientific research, Aristotle thinks, is sort of different from mythologizing. And that's really the beginnings of some stuff like that. Now, even Aristotle thought, so Aristotle, it's worth remembering, is an eternalist, meaning he thinks the world always has existed and always will exist. Now, I'm also an eternalist about the universe as a whole. I think there's always been a universe, there always will be. But Aristotle was an eternalist about the earth and about the species that are on it. So there have always been humans for Aristotle, and there always will be. Which means that everything we're ever going to discover, we have discovered before. And we've discovered it an infinite number of times before. So it's sort of the Battlestar Galactica. All this has happened before, all this will happen again. And he thinks that in the past, people have reached philosophy that even perhaps exceeds our own today. But then there are periodic cataclysms, their civilization collapses, and they maybe retain little bits of their older wisdom. But then, stories build up over time. And so sometimes Aristotle thinks, if you look really carefully at a myth, you can maybe discern what was ancient philosophy within it that's now got all this corrosion and rust of the centuries on top of it. But if you brush it away, you get something. And Aristotle thinks the idea that you find in some of these older myths that there are beings more divine than us and that they're up in the ether and they're eternal and they're always in motion, that's true. And and he thinks like the very word, the Greek word ether, that he and Plato give a pseudo etymology of aiethane, always running, always surging, right? He thinks like that preserves something from our ancient philosophers, that the heavens are in eternal motion, things like that. Okay, that's just an example of how some of this gets going with Aristotle. But of course, you see it in the modern age as well. You see it in the Enlightenment, people kind of wanting to get away from older worldviews. And sometimes, even you look at even earlier philosophy and science, and you dub it as mythology, right? And that's a way of kind of saying it's not serious. So you look at, say, the phlogiston theory of heat, and you go, that's just a myth, right? That's just made up. Now, it's not as if, say, Priestley, when he had used the phlogiston theory to explain certain things that happen with metals, which we understand correctly from Lavoisier on as oxidation, that it's not as if his phlogiston theory was just a made up thing. He was isolating metals, he was doing experiments, he had an idea. Ultimately, the theory of phlogiston was unworkable. But saying, it's just a myth or is a way of kind of discrediting it, or a way of pointing out the unreality of certain objects in its ontology. Phlogiston is not a real thing, just as Hephaestus is not a real thing, right? Phlogiston really is something people talked about. Hephaestus is really something people talked about and really thought at some point existed, but they were wrong. So that's Now, one last thing about how mythology plays a role in philosophy. Many theories, especially, I suppose, developmental, historical, Kantian kinds of epistemologies, kinds of views that don't just say, hey, here's a theory of knowledge out of nowhere, but like, here's a story about how the very practice of knowledge builds itself up over time. Like humans had to learn what knowledge was or what real knowledge was and what its methods were, and it grew over time. It had to grow out of more primitive kinds of expression and exploration of the world. Our very good, very reliable means of explaining the world had to come from less good, less reliable means. Now, it also had to come from reliable things. I would say it had to also come from reliable things like the senses, but like as a way of constructing a theory about the world or an account. Obviously, there was a time where people didn't know the difference between explaining physical forces in impersonal terms, perhaps, from explaining them in personal terms. Perhaps there was, at certain times or for certain cultures, there was no distinction between the physical and the personal, right? The volcano is angry, right? Something like, maybe they didn't always make these distinctions or things like that. And so there is sometimes in these traditions, and I think a good example here is the work of Ernst Cassirer, this notion that there has to be a kind of primitive, we have to have some theory about the primitive stages of cognition and culture, a mythic stage. And we have to at least make intelligible how it was possible for some people, like certain Greek philosophers, to emerge out of it from within it. Now, most scholars don't think it was this parthenogenic miracle. People used to talk about the Greek miracle. Like people had just believed in crazy myths, and all their stories, all their explanations of everything was just this god did this thing, and that's all they did. And then somewhere between 600 and 400 BCE, the Greeks just were geniuses, and suddenly they had science. And of course, that's a silly hyper oversimplification. But the basic idea of how did Greek science, philosophy emerge in whatever slow and halting way it did, with emphasis on halting and, not all at once kind of way, that is a real serious question. And that does require, among other things, trying to find where we can transitional forms, if you will, that in between the theologoi and the physiologoi, that between the theologians and the physicists or the naturalists that like Aristotle talks about. And it also may require, or at least people pursued this in the late 19th and early 20th century, a study of primitive societies today, a study of the remaining tribes who are isolated, who are not well integrated into much familiar with the science of the modern world, and what kinds of stories they tell each other and how these stories function. And in general, as well, people philosophically look for a theory of myth. This is clearly a major production. Like myth is not this weird thing. It's not even something we have isolated or removed from the modern world. We love our myths. We love our Batman stories and our Superman stories, and we love our biblical stories and our Greek stories, and we continue to tell them. Why? What do they do for us? What did they do for their inventors? Is it always the same thing? And you get sometimes monocausal or not monocausal, monoideological, single kind of accounts of myth, like all myths are primitive science. They're all ideological. They're all trying to explain things. You get theories like all myths are a representation of, at least all ancient myths are a representation of ritual. So this is like the view of Jane Harrison and James Frazier of the Golden Bough, that like all Greek myths are somehow translating a certain kind of ritual. Nobody, I think, very few people still think it's all one thing that myths are. But there is a very real question, since it is such a major kind of human cognitive production, there is a major sort of sociological, anthropological, philosophical, literary, psychological question about what myths are and why they are in our society or in primitive societies.
Yeah, I mean the relationship of stories to life, philosophy, just what narratives do when we don't even realize it. The way that art feeds us values, or how we derive values from art, I mean, is just a huge, huge topic. I know Ayn Rand has a lot to say about that, and in Romantic Manifesto and elsewhere. And of course, her use of mythology, Atlas Shrugged, be quite difficult to depict her theme so eloquently without the Greek myth of Atlas. So
Yes, that's true. I once gave a talk. I'd like to give it again at some point. I hope I'll have the occasion. But if you look at the fiction she completed after The Fountainhead, or you look at Rourke's speech in The Fountainhead, if you look at the fiction she completed after The Fountainhead, all of her protagonists are a Prometheus figure. So they're all this scientist figure who creates a new form of light or energy, considers bringing it to the world, and then withdraws their fire until people withdraw their vultures, as Francisco puts it in Atlas Shrugged. So you find this is certainly the case with Prometheus in Anthem. It's the case with Steve Ingalls in Think Twice, and it's the case with John Galt. So her three main protagonists afterwards are all explicitly a Prometheus figure. And it's quite significant that she goes to that myth 3 times in a row. It's not like she adores kind of repetition in her literature, in her fiction, but there's something, and I think I've identified what in this talk, that she finds really appealing about reworking this myth. The rework is that what's the same is that the kind of creation or introduction of light or energy is this enormous benefit to mankind. It is, in the etymological sense, philanthropic, loving humanity. But what is different is that though these Promethei remain the it doesn't matter, remain the benefactors of mankind. It is not the gods who punish them for the gift of fire. It is the men themselves who receive the fire who punish their benefactors. And it's they who have to, and Prometheus, of course, in Atlas Shrugged becomes Prometheus unbound, also in Anthem. They become freed of the chains, but the chains, of course, are the moral code itself of sacrifice. So anyway, there's a lot to say there, but absolutely the title of Atlas Shrugged does so eloquently kind of speak to the theme of the novel. And then she clearly was very much enamored with this use of the Prometheus myth.
Yeah, going all the way back to Anthem, of course. Wasn't that, spoiler alert, what he ends up naming himself?
It is, yes. So he names himself Prometheus, yes.
Yeah.
And that's right.
Should I read some? Do you have something else? We've got a couple minutes left. I was going to read some super chats. Should I do that? All right. Marilyn, thank you. Thank you, Shazbot. He says, can Apollo beat up Aries? No time to settle that. Jonathan, thank you. Jonathan, thank you. Ray, thank you. We'll have to get to your question another day. Marilyn, thank you. Do you have something? Looked like you were about to.
So it's not clear if Apollo could beat up Ares, but in the Iliad, during the Aristeia of Diomedes manages to beat up Ares, but does not beat up Apollo. He's scared to do that. He does all this with Athena's help.
Okay, so that you can deduce, you can bet on who you think would win. James, thank you. He says, I speak ancient Greek with classicists every Saturday. 6 years study, 3 conversation years, about to read Homer and Aristotle. Very nice. Cool. All right. Don't party too hard. No, I'm kidding. That sounds very, very enriching. Makes me wish I'd studied some Greek. Roland, thank you. He says, fascinating topic. Get better soon, Jason.
Thank you.
Well, super chats help, but really, you got to pray to the gods. Not just one, but many. Vigard, thank you. 100 Norwegian dollars. Sounds like a lot, but I don't think it really is. I mean, it's nice, but it's 100 euros. Now that would be cool. Not that I'm ungrateful. Enric 999 says, there looks to be a human need for complex super representations of humans throughout cultural development, up to comic book Superman, Spider-Man, etc., that continues to attract strong interest.
I think that's right. I think so. Maybe that's for another day. What exactly draws people into these? But part of it is, I like that term that you use, super representation. So here's the thing, right? Often people they look at themselves, they make gods or divine beings, spirits, who are versions of themselves. Then they later look back at those copies of themselves and they look to them for guidance or for warrant. So, for example, at a certain age, Bronze Age, I create a bunch of gods where there's a king of the gods. By the Iron Age, Greeks don't really have kings that much, but Zeus is still sort of the ranking king. And then Hellenistic kings come about and they say, well, look, Zeus is a king. Why wouldn't we do that too? So there is this odd interplay between God made in our image and then us reforging or reasserting ourselves in the basis of that image we have already created. I create a divine image of myself and now it justifies me in some weird way. And some people like Eliade have even think that like that's basically what the theory of forms is too. That all these theories are you copy this world to that this higher world, then you use that supposed higher world to justify this world qua its copy.
All right, and that's all the time we have today. The whole story topic makes me want to do an episode with you about Jordan Peterson at some point, if you're confident to do that, if you know enough about him. Just an idea, but a lot of other things we can discuss as well. And
I can study up. People tell me he talks a lot of Jungian stuff, and I can watch some videos or read a book or something. And,
he did he's most known, I think, for his kind of self-help type of book, but he did something called Maps of Meaning. That was his first book, so there's a lot in there, I'm sure.
Okay.
I mean, yeah, if you'd be down for that, as they say in the streets, I'd be down for that, because he's obviously a huge figure to contend with in the world today. All right, coming up at 8 p.m. UK time, James Valiant, Amy, and Robert Nasir will be discussing The Spirit of the 60s, an article by Leonard Peikoff from the Objectivist Forum. And that's all we have coming up today. Thank you all, everybody. Thank you, Jason. That's all the time we have. And goodbye.